The attention at this conference has been largely on climate change mitigation, that is, on what we can do about reducing greenhouse gases in order to reduce the amount of future climate change that we'll be faced with. Obviously, that's a critically important question, but it's not what I'm going to talk about. Instead, what I'm going to talk about is climate adaptation and the ways in which federalism may be a relevant consideration there. Why talk about adaptation? Well, first of all, there's the possibility that we won't adopt the kind of mitigation scheme that we ought to. And I'd like to say that, I wish I could say that was a zero probability, but obviously it's not. However, even if we do, as it turns out, there is a good deal of future climate change that's already locked into the climate system due to what we've already put in the atmosphere and the amount of heat the oceans have already absorbed. We are going to be faced with climate change for at least some decades to come, regardless of whether we respond properly in terms of mitigation. So adaptation is going to be an issue no matter what. The reason that the term mitigation is used about climate change instead of control or elimination is that all we can do is to mitigate climate change. We can reduce the severity, but at this point we can't prevent it from happening to some extent. And there are going to be, even in the optimistic scenarios, some substantial impacts that society is going to be faced with. So briefly, we're going to see if the models are correct in many parts of the world, including the American West, probably longer droughts and at the same time bigger floods. So we'll have more variability in rainfall. Longer dry periods punctuated by wetter raining periods. We're going to have sea level rise. That's the most predictable because the physics is pretty straightforward for at least part of it. Sea level rise makes a big difference. There is a lot of infrastructure that's located at sea level or very close to coastlands. There's electrical infrastructure. There's all the oil industry infrastructure that's around the Gulf Coast, for example. There are highways. I drove up on Highway 1 a couple weeks ago to Southern California, and you could see that the rocks were getting undercut in places, and the edge of the road was moving inward. We're going to see a lot more of that kind of thing. Heat waves, which Ann Carlson has written about, which don't get the attention of floods because they don't make for great pictures, but they can have devastating public health consequences. So lots of potentially bad stuff that we have to think about trying to deal with as best we can. Now, I think it is likely that much of the response will be at the state level because many of these impacts involve things like land use, siting of facilities, and so forth that are traditional state concerns. And so my focus really has been on how much of a role should the federal government play, and can the federal government play in dealing with these issues. Unlike with cap and trade schemes, I don't think there's any concern the states are going to get squeezed out. The question is how much of a role will the feds play? So let's begin with the question of federal standards. I can imagine, especially depending on how things go at the state level, that the feds might come up with standards for things like levee safety. We tend to think of the Army Corps of Engineers with levees, but in fact there are a lot of levees that are built by state and local governments and by private individuals. So I can imagine federal standards for that. Federal restrictions or incentives against building in floodplains, because those floodplains are going to get a lot more dangerous. Water conservation requirements in certain parts of the country, maybe requiring, for example, the use of certain kinds of equipment by farmers, or appliance standards for appliances that use water to try to deal with that issue. Requirements that municipalities have public health facilities that are capable of dealing with heat waves, so that the U.S. doesn't see something like the European heat wave a few years ago, which killed 25,000 people. Very quietly and invisibly, but the bodies piled up. So I can imagine that the feds might well take this direction. Hard to predict where, partly because we don't know how well the states will do. To what extent should there be federal standards? Here, without going into a lot of detail, a lot of the discussion earlier about the role the states can play and whether they should have a role, you can kind of flip it to ask, should the feds be doing anything? Is there a race to the bottom? Will states compete for real estate development by allowing development where it shouldn't be? Are there public choice problems with maybe real estate developers or irrigation groups having more clout at the state level than at the federal level, and if they do, is that a bad thing? Lack of competence. Some states, like California, clearly have the technical expertise and legal apparatus for addressing these issues. Not true everywhere in the country, right? I mean, it's not only important to know that California is not Delaware, but it's even more important to know that California is not Louisiana. So not every state government has the same ability to confront these issues. And there's a risk, and maybe this should have been first on my list, that states and cities will go easy on adaptation because they figure that if things go really south, really bad, the feds will bail them out, right? That if they let people build in the wrong place, the feds will come in with disaster relief, and the feds will pay for bigger levies and so on and so forth. And so the states will just figure they can get away with putting their resources and their attention somewhere else. So I think there are issues. So I think there are areas where you can make a real policy case for federal intervention, and I think we can expect to see some. Not necessarily in this form of direct federal regulation, where some federal agency issues rules and then they sue you if you don't comply. Could be that, but it could be financial incentives, tax credits, restrictions on what kind of insurance you can get or what you need to do in order to get insurance. There are a lot of different ways that the feds can intervene that all raise the same kind of question about whether it should be a federal issue or not a federal issue. Second question is, who pays for adaptation? A lot of this stuff is going to be expensive, right? If you think about what needs to be done with the California water system to prepare for a world in which we can't use the snowpack for storage, if you think about what needs to be done to protect the levees in the California Delta, if you think about all those issues in many other parts of the country as well, we're talking about billions of dollars. Now, admittedly, $10, $15, $100 billion doesn't seem like as much money as it used to before we started throwing around, trillion-dollar stimulus packages and so forth. But it's a lot of money. So should the feds pay or should the states pay? There are good arguments for why the states should pay that I should start with. Number one, generally, adaptation efforts will have local beneficiaries, and it's fair for the people who benefit to pay. Right? If it's your property that's being protected from flooding, why should somebody in Idaho have to pay for that? So there's a fairness argument. Connected with that is a moral hazard argument, which is if somebody else pays, you might end up spending a lot of money on stuff you don't need because you're not paying for it. And related to that is the prospect that this adaptation funding can turn into a huge pork barrel with all kinds of things being paid for by Congress that aren't necessarily needed, just like some of the anti-terrorist stuff that went to, places that aren't even, probably no terrorist in the world has ever heard of. But they do have a member of Congress. And so the formula was arranged to guarantee that they would get some aid. We don't want to see that. On the other hand, there are arguments for why the feds might well want to play a role in financing this stuff. First of all, there's the California is not Louisiana point again, both in terms of the government's competence to engage in these things, which they may need help with, but also because Louisiana is really poor compared to California. Louisiana, Mississippi, a number of the other states are well below the economic standards of the sort of cutting-edge economic centers of the country. And they may not be able to afford to do what they need. So that's one reason.